More than 4 billion people around the world use the internet. Almost 75% of them live in the global south. The online population in Africa, Asia, and Latin America has grown faster than anywhere else in the world. And yet, their voices are missing, or are underrepresented in global debates on digital and cyber issues. This makes all of us poorer. To achieve more inclusive, open, and prosperous societies, we need to close the representation gap.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our last keynote speech during the Closing the Gap conference. Today we have an extreme honor of having with us Johanna Weaver, who many of you know as the Australia's representative to the UNGGE, but also a participant in the open-ended working group on cyber issues at the UN. The gap we will try to close and explore with Johanna is the representation and diversity gap. And Johanna in her career has closed many of those gaps in her own professional life, and she's going to share some of those stories with us. I think the reason why we try to address this representation and diversity gap is quite clear if you look at the of how our conference has unfolded over the past week. We have tried to bring to the conversation representatives of the Global South, different industries, academia, researchers, and policymakers. And I think we've done it to some extent, but that gap still persists. And as we try to demonstrate in the video, that actually makes all of us poorer and puts us at a disadvantage. It's not really the loss for one of those sides. And my personal story, whenever I think about this diversity and representation gap, is that probably some of the most exciting and interesting events that I've attended were exactly when I was able to listen to those other perspectives and really get a chance to learn from others. So thank you to all of you who joined us over the past week and shared your stories and your experiences with us over the past week. Joanna, that's, I think, that much for introduction. Nobody is here to listen to me, but rather to you. So I stopped there, and I'll give you the floor. And thank you very much again for joining us, which I know is also from during your holidays. So that really demonstrates again your commitment to closing the gap and engaging with the community.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to your team, to EU Cyber Direct, and to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Belgium for having me here today. Genuinely congratulations on what is an extraordinary conference on a topic that is so very important. But I also wanted to commend you in particular for the diversity of your speakers list through this. I hear a lot of people talking about diversity and inclusion, but I think this conference really is a fabulous example of walking the walk as well as talking the talk. I'm going to be speaking to you today about closing the diversity gap. I would like to address it from a few different perspectives. I'm going to make a case for diversity from what I call a constructivist perspective. I'm then going to back this up with some data on why diversity is important. And then I wanted to share some personal observations. But first, I think it's important that we address two foundational questions. The first is, what is diversity? And then the second is, in this conversation, we are asking for diversity in what? So the first question of what is diversity, I think when a lot of people hear the word diversity, they think of things like gender, race, and ethnicity. But as you've highlighted, Patrick, just now in your introduction and in many of the other conversations that have happened over this week, diversity is much broader than that. It covers a diversity of religious, political beliefs, age, education, career path, industry and socioeconomic backgrounds, sexual orientations, disability, and cultures. So when I'm speaking today about diversity, I'm speaking about diversity in the fullest sense of its word, fullest sense of the meaning. And the second foundational question, looking at what are we are seeking diversity in what? Now, this conference is very much focused in diversity in representation, in discussions in the way we engage on cyber and digital issues. But diversity in this context is much broader. So within cyber, digital, tech fields, when we're talking about diversity, you can talk about it from those who are designing the technology, from those who are funding the technology, those that are operating the technology, those that are securing the technology, those that we want to regulate or develop the policy for the technology, decision makers, and really importantly, diversity in end users, but also diversity in end uses. Because the way that somebody uses a piece of technology in one part of the world may be very, very different or for a very different purpose than in another. So I'm happy to talk about each of those different types of diversity as we go through or in the Q&A session. But what I wanted to focus my remarks upon today was not the types of diversity, but more on why we should value diversity. And the first case that I will make, as I said, is a constructivist argument. And I'm not actually going to make the case myself. I'm going to use the words from a fabulous book called Broadband by Claire L. Evans. And I highly recommend this book to anyone who's interested in diversity. And I'm going to quote directly from the conclusion of that book. So Claire Evans says, when we create technologies, we don't just mirror the world, we actually make it. And we can remake it, so long as we understand the awesome nature of that responsibility. The more diversity there is at the table, the more interesting the result. The more human, the better. There is no right kind of engineer. No special plane of thought that must be reached in order to make a worthwhile contribution. There is no right education, no right career path. Sometimes there isn't even a plan. The internet is made of people, and it was made for people, and it does what we tell it to do. We can remake the world. Now, some people will find this statement inspiring, and others might dismiss it as a little bit utopian. For the record, I am very much in the inspired camp, and indeed it was a very similar argument made by Lawrence Lessig in his book, Code 2.0, that sparked my initial interest in this field and a career change. But for those who find this argument lacking in practical specificity, let me turn to the second case for diversity, which is looking at how the data backs this up. Now, first point I would make on this is that data on diversity is actually quite hard to come by. That's another issue, and I won't go into that now. But the data that we do have is clear. The benefits of diversity go far beyond optics. The data reveals two clear benefits. The first is in innovation, and the second is in performance. So if we turn to the first, the data reveals something that we all intrinsically know, and that is hinted at in the constructivist argument, that a diversity in input produces a diversity of outputs. So Boston Consulting Group's study, Diversity and Inclusion survey from 2018, found a strong and statistically significant correlation between the diversity of management teams and overall innovation. Now, this was a survey for businesses, and the measurement quota that they had was looking at innovation revenue. But I think it is equally transferable, and the lessons transferable to those of us who work in the public sector. The survey found that a team with above average diversity in management reported an innovation revenue that was 19% higher than those with below average leadership diversity. Interestingly as well, the small changes delivered large results. And the most significant gains from diversity changes in the leadership team came in terms of changing and having diversity in terms of the national origin of executives, the range of industry backgrounds, gender balance, and career paths. Interestingly, the survey found that age and educational background had lesser impact. So the first thing we can take from the data is that diversity creates an environment for greater innovation. The second is that greater diversity leads to higher performance. And here, there's a fabulous set of surveys that have been done by McKinsey's. The latest of that was released just last month in May 2020. Diversity Wins: How Inclusion Matters. But what's notable about this particular set of surveys is it builds on data from 2015 and from 2018. So it's one of the few multi-year data-based reports that we have. And the results in this are quite dramatic. So looking at greater diversity in representation leading to a much higher likelihood of outperformance. Looking at gender, companies with 30% more women executives were more likely to outperform companies where they had only 10 to 30% of women executives. And those companies in turn were more likely to outperform those with fewer women. There was a substantially differential likelihood of overperformance. 48% separates the most from the least gender diverse companies. So that is a pretty astounding statistic. It's saying that if you have gender diverse executive teams, you are 48% more likely to outperform a team that does not have that diversity. And the case for ethnic and cultural diversity is just as compelling. So in 2019, companies with the highest diversity outperformed those with the lowest levels of diversity by 36%. And this is up from 33% in 2017 to 35% in 2014. So for those of you who are statisticians, and I'm not, I frankly find the statistics a bit boring, but for those of you who are, the statistics and the data make a strong business case for diversity. Diverse teams will be more innovative and will outperform teams that are lacking in diversity. So I wanted to also draw on some of my personal experiences, which have also demonstrated to me the value of diversity. One of which relates to gender and the other of which relates to disability. And unfortunately, with respect to gender, the more senior I become, the more I see the impact of the lack of gender diversity. I see it in particular in unacceptable behaviour. In the last year, I have had to respond to objectionable comments, inappropriate invitations, and uninvited physical contact from male colleagues. And I'm not alone in this. The energy that it takes to rebuff these approaches whilst maintaining professional composure is significant. And aside from the personal impact, which should not be diminished or belittled, in economic jargon, the energy spent responding to this type of unacceptable behaviour comes at a massive opportunity cost for performance and innovation. Another area where I see the impact of the lack of gender diversity is in attention to the voices of women. There are a plethora of studies that show that women are more regularly interrupted, talked over, misheard, or misperceived when they speak. In my professional experience, I often see good ideas put forward by women that are simply not heard or which are dismissed as irrelevant. And sometimes, and I love it when this happens, then lauded as wonderful ideas when repeated as by male colleagues. But I want to be really clear here. This is not about contestability. To contest an idea, to disagree with a concept, you first have to hear the idea. However, it is about actively listening to diverse voices, not just of those of women, but diversity as I defined more broadly at the start of this talk. And in doing so, as the data demonstrates, you will enhance innovation and increase overall performance. Another personal experience that I have related to diversity is drawn from disability. So I have chronic dyslexia. And while for a long time dyslexia was often associated with a lack of intelligence, it's now understood that people who have dyslexia process information differently. Our brains are literally not wired the same as other people's. This means that traditional methods, phonetic methods of being taught to read, make no sense to us. Combined with the fact that many people with dyslexia have high IQs, you often have bored and frustrated young students who then become pigeonholed as troublemakers. Fortunately for me, through a combination of competition and support from family and teachers, which in turn drove my own determination and stubbornness, I was still able to excel, notwithstanding being chronically dyslexic. But it has, however, taken me a very long time to see the value of my difference. So let me give you a really practical example. If I'm in a room of people with a problem, given a problem to solve, 9 times out of 10, I will address that problem from a very different angle or propose a solution that is very different to most other people in the room. Now, sometimes my ideas are diabolically terrible. Occasionally, they are standalone flashes of brilliance. But most often, when tested and combined with other views in the room, my crazy ideas from the margins help reshape conventional thinking into something new, something extraordinary. And by definition, to create something extraordinary, you need to add something extra to the ordinary. And in my view, the richest source of the extra is diversity. So you can say this of dyslexia, but also of all of the other different types of diversity that we've spoken about earlier. It's the combination of the diverse thinking that puts the extra into the ordinary. But you also need to make sure that we have an environment where the diverse voices have the courage to speak up and that the mainstream are prepared to listen. In this respect, it's taken me a really long time to be able to own my difference. For a long time, I thought there was something wrong with me. And I kept quiet in a room full of people that were thinking differently from me. But as your introduction said, it is in no one's interests for these diverse voices not to be heard. So how do we close this gap? It's not enough to simply say that we value diversity. And frankly, it's also not enough just to have diverse representation. We need to also have diverse participation. And this is what I think this conference has done particularly well at. So we need to create an environment that is diverse and inclusive. And here I'm going to return to the McKinsey's report that I referred to at the start of this presentation, which had a look at, of its most diverse companies, the companies that are the most likely to overperform. What did they have in common? What was the common threads that they had? And they found 5 common threads. And most significantly, it was that each of those organisations had taken systematic and bold steps to strengthen inclusion. So first, we need to ensure that we have diverse representation, but that diversity is not just seen, but also heard. Second, you need to strengthen leadership and accountability capabilities. And the capabilities part here is important. We shouldn't just assume that our leaders have the skills to foster diversity. We need to give them the skills, and then we need to hold them to account afterwards. We need to also ensure that we have equal opportunity through fairness and transparency in selection processes, funding processes, and I think you'll talk about that on the next panel this afternoon, pay and promotions processes, and in particular to de-bias those processes. Fourthly, you need to promote openness and tackle microaggressions. So having a zero tolerance policy for discriminatory behaviour, but also equipping people and teams to deal with diversity. It's not easy. This is not something that necessarily comes naturally to all people. So we need to give people those tools. And the fifth, the most important, is about fostering belonging, creating an environment where even though you may be diverse, you feel that you are able to speak up, that you belong and your voice is important and to be heard. So in conclusion, I certainly do not purport to be an expert on closing the gap, although I am very passionate about and committed to closing the gap. Nor have I personally experienced the level of discrimination or bias that many others do on a day-to-day basis. But I do hope that in providing a constructivist perspective, in highlighting the data, and in sharing a few of my personal anecdotes, that I have persuaded you, whoever you are, no matter your background, that you personally and we collectively stand to benefit if we embrace diversity and create an inclusive environment in which diversity can thrive. Thank you.
Joanna, thank you very much. If this room was full, I'm sure you'd be getting a standing ovation. I'm already getting messages on WhatsApp from people who are watching that they're declaring love for you. So I must say, thank you very much for sharing this personal experience. I would like to recall so that you know that people indeed are watching and listening and sympathize with what you say. And thank you for sharing this very personal experience as well, which I'm sure many of our female colleagues are going to, and probably male as well in some instances, associate with. We have a comment from Ximena Kurowska from Central European University, and Ximena participates quite frequently in our activities, so she's quite familiar with your let's say, more official role and your speeches at the UN, but maybe not this personal declaration. She says, many thanks for speaking up in such a straightforward way about the harm of gender intimidation and ableism. Many can relate on a daily basis, of course. And I think it's really important. We had this discussion yesterday during the career track to have these mentors and role models in a community that actually also say, like you just did right now, that sometimes speaking up in a completely different mind, an idea that might seem crazy to you, it might actually sometimes be quite an innovative solution, and we shouldn't really be quiet about this. So I'm also monitoring if there are other questions coming in, but what I also found extremely interesting in your presentation was this connection with constructivism. And I wrote my PhD with one of the godfathers of constructivism, Fritz Kratter, who I'm sure would be extremely happy to see how constructivism is making it mainstream in cyber conversations. But indeed, there's this idea of mainstreaming versus new ideas, and how we actually get the mainstream listen to these unconventional voices. I was wondering if you could really share with us if there's any kind of a practical way to go about it, because we might agree here that, you know, yes, it does make everybody poor, but you know very well and probably better than us that it's extremely difficult sometimes to speak over, as you said, old school diplomats, policymakers who always think that they're right and there is only one way of dealing with things. How can we kind of build a bridge to that community and close that specific gap? I think there's one dimension there that you have not mentioned, but I think it's also the age plays quite an important role. Very often, as young scholars and researchers, we are meeting on the other side, you know, experienced diplomats who have built their careers, sometimes during the times of the Cold War, sometimes right after, and the language we're speaking is different. So do you have any tips for those who are really trying to engage but are very often confronted with this wall and still are trying to figure out how to get through?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I can share maybe a personal perspective and then a more professional perspective. From a personal perspective, I think it's really important that when you're approaching these conversations that you do so prepared with the facts, with all of the data that you have, but also if you are presenting something that is a little bit left field, that you acknowledge that to the person that you're presenting it. And if you're presenting perhaps to someone who is significantly older than you, perhaps draw in a reflection of, you know, can you remember what it was like when you took a crazy idea to your boss? To personalize it, to bring it back to them. I found that to be a really quite effective tool. I think also something that we can all do on a one-to-one basis, but also in group conversations, is make a personal commitment yourself that you value diversity and that you will seek out diversity. So if you're in a room full of people that is being dominated by one or two particular personalities in the room, or if you are coming to the end of a meeting and somebody hasn't spoken, be the person who says, "Hey, Patrick, you haven't spoken up. Did you have any thoughts or observations?" Be the person who creates the opening for the diverse voice to speak. And sometimes that's all it actually needs. So I think from both perspectives, that's a really useful way. And then from a more professional way, it is also creating opportunities for those diverse voices to be in the room and for them to engage meaningfully. And from my perspective, probably the best, one of the most inspiring projects that I've been involved in has been our Women in Cyber program, which has brought 35 women from all around the world to the UN in New York to participate in the open-ended working group discussions. But we also had training the week before, we had mentoring, so that when people were engaging in those discussions, they were doing so with as much knowledge and expertise in addition to what they had already brought to the table. So there's lots that you can do from every perspective when you're looking at it.
Excellent, thank you. So let me kind of do my job as a researcher now, and maybe push you on some of the points that you've made, abstracting maybe and zooming out from the professional experience and bringing it back to the international conversations. When you said unacceptable behavior, I was already expecting something. Let's talk about accountability. You took it in a different direction. Let me take it to the more conventional conversations. Now, I think the conversation about the lack of diversity is not a theoretical one. You kind of spoke really about this very hands-on approach when we construct our teams, how we engage with people, and so on. But when I thought about it ahead of this session this morning as well, I actually realized how often this lack of diversity, or maybe our limited openness to engage with others, is sometimes being instrumentalized or even weaponized by our political adversaries. And I'm thinking here, for instance, the arguments that Russia made when calling for the open-ended working group, that the reason why we need it, as opposed to UNGGE, is that the latter is a Klaus club of a limited group of countries who are primarily developed economies with who are well resourced and basically think only about militarization of cyberspace, neglecting everybody else in the South and in the developing world. Now, that's the argument, as you know, that has actually resonated quite well in the global South and in the developing countries who kind of voted in support of the open-ended working group, seeing it as an opening for them exactly to bring that voice to the conversation. So I'm wondering whether you thought, based already on almost 2 years experience with the open-ended working group and UNGGE, whether indeed actually there's this kind of openness that was initially kind of the idea of openness that was hijacked to some extent by Russia in the conversation and insistence on capacity building and kind of pretending themselves as those who are more inclusive and open way, although in theory only rather than really in practice, is something that we should be addressing more from the structural perspective as well. So in other words, how can we bring those other voices into the conversation so that we disarm the arguments about the lack of diversity beyond open-ended working group and UNGGE?
Yeah, well, I think that I don't disagree with the fact that we need to have a broader conversation and the utility of having the open-ended working group conversation, which is the broader conversation. I think it's slightly disingenuous sometimes that Russia is making that argument, given that it was the largest proponent of the GGE for most of the process. So it's sort of changing its argument. But nonetheless, the point is definitely a good one. And one of the most notable things through the open-ended open-ended working group process has been not only the level of participation, but also the quality of participation. We really have had a full room, maybe not 193 countries, but certainly getting more countries than we ever have had before, having a conversation, but also then in the follow-up conversations, going back to Capital, saying we need to develop policies on this. We need to come up with a position. These conversations are actually happening. And I think that's probably what the most notable difference between the open-ended working group has been, its visibility, because the GGE has actually been relatively inclusive over time. It's a smaller group format, but it has been open to many different countries. But what is particularly notable, and I think the chair, Ambassador Lauber, the Swiss chair, has really made a great commitment to making sure, all of the documents are public, to make sure that meetings wherever possible are open. And ironically, some of the countries that are the countries who've been calling for inclusivity have then objected to the inclusion of broader civil society industry in those conversations. So one of the things that we have done through our process, so I'm Australia's head of delegation on both the open-ended working group and the GGE. And so when there's been a situation where we have had a closed meeting, we've made a point of having public consultations, call for input, and really incorporating that into Australia's input. And it is, I think it was you, Patrick, at the start who said that some of the most interesting conferences you've been to have been ones where you have that diversity or being able to hear from different types of people. Certainly from my perspective, the most interesting ideas that I've had through the GGE and through the open-ended working process have come from voices that I would not necessarily have expected to have deep and insightful thoughts on these topics, which really to me affirms the diversity, the value of diversity, but also how often I think we have such a lack of diversity in conceptualizing diversity, that as we begin to get more and more diverse voices into the room, I think we're only just beginning to see the true impact of how that will influence the outcome. But it is absolutely vital that we have those diverse voices there in the room.
Thank you, Joanna. I will let you go soon. I have one more question from Elina Noor from the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Malaysia. How do we get constructivist idea effectively reflected in a very realist environment of great power dynamics and that has now been projected onto cyberspace? Very interesting question. Thank you, Elina.
Thank you, Elina. You always come up with great questions. Look, I think the answer is having really good and thoughtful cooperation between those that are building and making the technology and those that are in the center of the great power dynamics. Because I think there is still a bit of a disconnect between those two communities, and to the extent that maybe there isn't necessarily the full appreciation on both sides of the impact of building technology that doesn't take into account geopolitics or the dynamics that are happening. And likewise, the more policy community talking almost in a little bit of a bubble without breaking in and coming across. So I think things like the cyber and tech retreat that our Ambassador for Cyber Affairs does with the Danish tech ambassador is a really great example of that, where we bring together all of the many different countries from their leads on cyber and digital policy, take them to Silicon Valley to have that face-to-face conversation. That is one example of how we can begin to break down those barriers, but it's also us taking it to those that are making the technology and saying, we know that technology is made by humans and we demand that it be made in a different way. And partly that's getting that message out, because I think people are very much takers of technology still rather than shapers of technology.
Joanna, thank you very much. We have kept you longer than we've promised, so I apologize for that, but I'm sure that those who have followed will be very grateful because this was very insightful conversation. Thank you very much for sharing both your personal and professional stories. We're always keen on hearing how people get to the business, how they navigate it, and actually what are the challenges they're facing. So I'm sure that those who have followed the conversation will be really very grateful. And I'm sure there will be many more people who will want to continue on some of those aspects whenever they get the chance to see you next in person, by email, or whatever other means they have. I really appreciate you being here with us. So thank you, Joanna. Please stay safe and enjoy the rest of your holiday. And we look forward to talking to you again very soon.